Hello, everybody. My name is Adrienne Hedrick. Thanks for tuning in today to this presentation. I'm fairly new to Macintosh Perry's Energy Division, and my role here is Regulatory and Environmental Development Manager. Today, I wanted to do a presentation on air emission regulations and some of the incentive programs that are available out there right now in order to achieve compliance with those regulations. The agenda today includes a brief introduction on the topic, so why this topic and why right now, as well as an air emission regulation overview. It also includes some of the current incentive programs that are out there right now and some of the incentive programs that are coming out where we've had hints of what's coming, but all the details haven't quite been released yet. And then I'll also chat a little bit about how Macintosh Perry can help support our clients with both achieving compliance with the regulations as well as accessing some of that incentive funding that's available right now. So I'm sure, as all of you have felt it, there's been a real steep incline in regulatory requirements for the oil and gas industry, really over the last few years, and still a lot of new requirements that are coming into play over the next few years. With regards to those requirements, there has been a strong focus on air emissions and limiting the amount of air emissions our oil and gas facilities produce. There's been requirements both at a federal and a provincial level that have come into play. And really, the significance has driven the need for us to be more innovative than ever, I feel, in our facility design and in efficiency at running our facilities. Luckily, there has been some new programs that have come up to try and help support these owners in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions at facilities. So a lot of movement in the clean tech space, and then also a lot of incentive programs that are aimed at providing financial support for making changes at facilities. These programs, I think, really open up the door to actually be able to move forward with some new projects at some of the facilities that are not currently in compliance with some of these limits, or maybe at facilities that you want to exceed some of those compliance criteria. As far as air emission regulations go, I'm going to touch on 5 different regulations today. The majority of the focus will be on methane regulations and greenhouse gases and carbon programs, and that's because they do tie directly into the incentive programs that I'm going to chat about today. As well, the focus will be on Alberta, as that is also where the incentive programs that I'm talking about today apply to. I will quickly do an overview, though, on the multi-sector air pollutant regulations, the National Pollutant Release Inventory, and the ambient air quality objectives and guidelines as well. As far as methane regulations go, our federal government committed Canada to reducing our methane emissions by 40 to 45% by 2025. So these were commitments that were made as a part of the Paris Agreement in December of 2015. Methane is really being targeted because of its potency as a greenhouse gas. It's considered to be at least 25 times more potent than CO2. So really, you're getting better bang for your buck if you're able to reduce your methane emissions compared to most other emissions that are out there. And the oil and gas facilities are being targeted because we are the largest emitter of methane within Canada, releasing 44% of total methane emissions. Now, these are the regulations that have come out in recent years. So at a federal level in 2018, they released their regulations on reducing the amount of methane that could be emitted from oil and gas facilities across Canada. And then over the last 18 months, Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan have all put a lot of time into creating their own regulations and their own methodologies for achieving that 45% reduction of methane emission limits. So what Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan did was they took their suggested regulations to the federal government and asked them for equivalency. This process took quite a bit of time, but in the last few months, all 3 of those provinces were granted federal equivalency on methane regulations. So that basically just means that when you're operating a facility now within Alberta, you follow the Alberta provincial requirements as opposed to the federal ones, and the same goes for BC and Saskatchewan. So within Alberta, you're looking at your Directive 60 and your Directive 17 are the 2 main documents where most of the new regulations are held. In addition, the AER, as they usually do, has put out a lot of other manuals, guidance documents, videos, tutorials, stuff like that to help for additional support on methane regulations. Within British Columbia, there was changes to the drilling and production regulation. And within Saskatchewan, there was changes on so they created a methane action plan, as well as an oil and gas emission management regulations. I do have further details on BC and Saskatchewan as well, so you can always reach out to me to get those at that in the future. But as I mentioned today, my focus will be on Alberta. So when we're looking at methane emission limits, the major areas that have been targeted for reductions are looking at your overall facility venting limits, your pneumatic devices, your compressor seals, your glycol dehydrators, and fugitive emissions. I'm going to go through each of those categories as a very high-level overview. One of the things that I do want to note is that this is just an overview and that there are lots of other nuances and exceptions and details that might be specific to facility type or owners or operators, that they should still be familiar with Directive 60 as well, but that this is just an overview. So when you're looking at your facility venting limits, the major thing I wanted to point out on this slide is that your new facility is designed after January 1st or that come into operation after January 1st, 2022. They actually have a significantly reduced methane limit compared to existing facilities. So about 1/5 of the amount of methane is allowed to be released from new facilities that are constructed after January 1st, 2022. That's a fairly significant value. And so it really just reiterates the creativity and innovation that we need to apply to new facility designs going forward. When we're looking at our pneumatics, the real goal of AER here is to move away from high bleed instruments that are run off of natural gas. So they're looking for conversion to electrification or instrument air to be running pneumatic devices. And where that's not possible, like in remote locations, they're looking for you to switch out from high bleed to low bleed instrumentation. When looking at compressor seals, they have set limits for the amount of methane that you're able to vent from your reciprocating and your centrifugal compressor seals. An interesting thing to note for the limits here is that in 2019, I was able to take part in a assessment of thousands of compressors across North America. So a lot of the data did come from the EPA. So a lot of it was for the United States, but some of the data was also out of Canada. And it was an assessment of how long after you replace a compressor seal will you be exceeding these regulatory limits. And what that assessment showed, and it's not a formal study, it was something that was done in-house. What that study showed was that although most manufacturers are recommending changing your compressor seals out after around 8 to 10 years, they're actually in non-compliance with these regulatory limits within about 2 or 3 years. So that's a fairly significant finding, and I think that in general, replacing your compressor seals more often may prevent you from exceeding these limits. But in the cases that they are, and it's too expensive or onerous to switch out those compressor seals, there are some other options available for capturing that vented gas as well. And there's some things in the works on redesigning compressors as well. When it comes to glycol dehydrators and fugitive emissions, your glycol dehydrators now also have a methane limit per unit per day. And this is completely new. I think everybody's used to dealing with benzene when it comes to glycol dehydrators, but now we also have to look at methane. So as of January 1st, 2022, those limits will be in place. A different limit again for existing versus new glycol dehydrators. Now, when we're looking at fugitive emissions, I know that this is an area that was fairly new to a lot of owners and operators. Some people had some extent of a fugitive emission plan in place, but it was never prescriptive. It never had to follow a certain regulatory protocol. Well, now going forward, actually starting earlier this year, January 1st of this year, well sites all require annual screenings for fugitive emissions, and other facilities require 1 to 3 fugitive emission surveys per year. The frequency really relates to the facility category type as per Directive 56. And once you find a leak, an owner has 30 days to repair it. There's quite a few exceptions when it comes to that timeline, but that's the timeline that's been noted within Directive 60. Now, it's one thing to have all of these limits in place, but a lot of people automatically like to ask, well, how is the AER going to know if we're meeting them or not? And how strict are they going to be, and how are they going to enforce? So there is annual methane reporting that has been started. The first annual report would have been submitted on January 1st, 2020, and that's both through One Stop, which is an AER online application system. So it's reported through One Stop as well as through Petronex, where methane emissions tie into the production accounting side of things, and they're also reported through Petronex. In addition to reporting on the actual emission values, which, by the way, those numbers that I kind of showed you on the last 5 slides, or those areas, those are the same areas that you'd be reporting on an annual basis. But in addition to reporting those actual values of methane being emitted, 2 plans were also required to be submitted by the AER. So one was your methane reduction and retrofit compliance plan, which was meant to be a detailed plan that looked at all of a company's assets and determined whether they were or weren't in compliance, or maybe they weren't sure on some of those yet, and really a plan for how they were going to bring those sites into compliance, where they were going to be doing retrofits, what their schedule and budget would look like over the next few years in order to get all of their sites into compliance. And then in addition to that plan, there was also a fugitive emission management plan. And that plan outlined the company's plan for how they were going to, both really a budget and resources for how they were going to get all of their fugitive emission surveys done each year that they were required. And last I heard, so a few months after the deadline of January 1st, 2020 for those 2 plans, I had heard from the AER that there was about 70% of operators and owners that had submitted those plans, and that a lot of them were promised as coming in the next little while, and some owners and operators were a little bit more unresponsive. So those plans are definitely a big undertaking for owners and operators, and they're also a really good source of information for even someone like us to take a look at and be able to help you prioritize some of the retrofits that you might have to do over the next few years. Where can you get your best bang for your buck, as far as if this is the budget that you have, where can we do some emission reduction retrofits for you? So I'm going to move off of methane now. I know that was a very brief overview, but I don't want to get too much into the details, as I'm sure some of you have been dealing with methane already quite a bit over the last year. I do want to touch base on the Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Regulation, commonly referred to as TIER. So TIER is really the core of emission management within Alberta. It implements Alberta's industrial carbon pricing and emission trading system. And most of us feel that it's really an improved system over the federal system. It's really meant to drive innovation and clean technologies into the oil and gas industry, as opposed to just paying a carbon tax. So the TIER regulation applies to facilities that emit more than 100,000 tons of CO2e per year. And it also applies to facilities with less than 100,000 tons if you want to opt in. So facilities that can opt in would include facilities that have more than 10,000 tons of CO2e emissions per year if they're in direct competition with some of those facilities that are regulated under TIER. Also, new within the last year was that conventional oil and gas facilities can combine multiple facilities as an aggregate and opt into TIER that way. So a lot of people are finding that that's a strategic way to reduce the amount of federal carbon tax that they're paying on some of their facilities. And really being regulated by TIER, why would you want to be? Some people are saying, who opts into regulations? Well, the reason why you'd want to be regulated by TIER is because it does exempt you from the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which is basically your federal carbon tax. So you're paying more of a provincial system, as opposed to paying the federal carbon tax if you use this system. So how do you become compliant under TIER? What does that look like? So emission reduction obligations are determined for facilities according to a benchmark approach. So this can either be a facility-specific benchmark, where several years of data for a specific facility are used to calculate what a benchmark would look like for that facility. Or you can also use high-performance benchmarks for that facility type in general. So, for example, if you had 10 natural gas plants with a similar output, you could calculate what a performance benchmark would be for a natural gas plant. So the operators are able to choose basically the less stringent of the two approaches for their facilities to determine what benchmark they want to be trying to achieve. And those benchmarks are tightening annually by 1% beginning in 2020. And what you're really looking at is the benchmark is really an allowable amount of emissions or a threshold for the amount of emissions that you're allowed to emit from a facility. And facilities that emit less than their benchmark are able to sell performance credits through TIER or on the Alberta carbon offset market. Now, if you exceed your benchmark for that facility, there's a few different things you can do to become compliant with TIER. So one of them is that you can work to reduce your emissions on site, which really is the overall goal of this program. But until you're able to get there, it might take years to get there for some facilities. So you can use emission performance credits generated through the TIER program. You can use Alberta-based offsets, which are purchased on the Alberta carbon market. And you can also pay into the TIER fund. So for 2020, they charged $30 a ton per CO2 equivalent that basically exceeded your benchmarked value. And just to get an idea of what kind of funding is going into this, just recently in the last 3 weeks, 2 weeks maybe even, it was announced that $750 million from this TIER fund was being put back into various programs to reduce emissions at oil and gas facilities. So some of that money went to the clean technology sector for advancing research and development or pilot programs and funding. And then some of that went into some of the incentive programs that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Some of the additional regulations that I mentioned I would touch base on, but not really get into detail, are on this slide. So your multi-sector air pollutant regulations are basically a set of standards that reduce the amount of NOx emissions that can be emitted from boilers, heaters, and engines at oil and gas facilities. The NOx emission standards are going to get tighter and tighter, really starting in 2021 and then all the way up to 2036. And then there's also the National Pollutant Release Inventory. This is just an inventory where we have to report federally any substances on their list that we emit from our facilities. And so there's a prescribed list of substances that may pose a risk to human health or environment, and those get reported federally each year. And then there's also the Alberta Ambient Air Quality Objectives. And this is a provincial set of objectives where air modeling or screening is really required to determine if a facility meets or achieves these objectives. So some of the common things that are on that list that we see at our facilities would be SO2, H2S, carbon monoxide, NO2, and benzene. And there are others that sometimes come up as well. Again, I'm not going to touch too much on these regulations. I really think that they have enough detail that they'll probably require future presentations or information sessions. And so I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the incentive programs that tie into the carbon and methane regulations that I just discussed. So the first program is the Industrial Energy Efficiency and Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage Program. Nice long acronym there, as if we don't need more of those within the regulatory world, but this is an $80 million grant program that proponents can potentially access if they're wanting to utilize a new technology to reduce emissions at their facility. So this is run directly by Alberta Environment and Parks, and it was a really fast turnaround for this incentive program. So it was only released a few weeks ago, and the deadline for application is October 30th, 2020. So I know that that's coming up really fast. And so really the way I want to think about these is if you haven't heard about this program yet, maybe there were some projects that you had already considered applying some new technology to, or undertaking some projects that would reduce emissions at a facility, and now you want to pick back up those projects and see if they might qualify for this grant program in the next little while here. So obviously in the next week here. So the grant covers up to 75% of a project cost to implement an emission reducing technology. And the project costs what's considered a project cost is actually a fairly exclusive list. It includes salaries, it includes your construction costs, your equipment costs, among others. There's a pretty detailed list on what you can include in that. And then there is a maximum of $20 million per operator or per project, depending on how the applications come in. Decisions on the grants are expected to be made in fall or early winter 2020. And then this isn't really a first come, first serve basis. So all the applications that are received by October 30th will all be evaluated based on the same criteria. There's 5 areas of criteria that they outline that applications will be evaluated against. And anyone who achieves acceptance, they actually meet all of the evaluation criteria, will get a portion of the funds, up to 75% of the project costs. So the eligibility for this program is it's really aimed at tier regulated facilities or facilities that are eligible to be tier regulated. For aggregated facilities under tier can apply, but only emissions from stationary fuel combustion devices are being considered because those are the emissions that are regulated under tier for those types of facilities. So this is really aimed at your bigger facilities, but conventional oil and gas facilities could potentially apply if they're an aggregate under the tier program. There isn't a minimum or maximum project cost for this one. And as I mentioned, only emissions that are regulated under tier are eligible to be considered in your application. And one of the commitments that you do have to make when you're applying for this program is that you are committing to paying that remaining 25% of the project costs, whether that's internally or whether there's other external funding in place. A part of the application does require a letter being signed by an executive within the company stating that there is that 25% budget planned for this project within the next year. And you also have to meet a couple other clauses here in regulations. I'll have a link available to you guys, so I won't go over those, but for the most part, most emission reducing technology that's been proven is accepted for the sake of this grant program. And existing projects are actually eligible as well. However, you can't use any of the funding towards retroactive project costs. So if you're halfway through implementing a project that has significant emission reduction, then you can potentially claim up to 75% of the cost that you still have to incur for that project. Now, another program that's out there, also released just a couple of weeks ago, is the Methane Technology Implementation Program, or MTIP. So this program is aimed, again, at any technologies that are being added to facilities to reduce their methane emissions. A fund of $25 million has been allocated to this program, and it's implemented through Carbon Connect International, already open for applications. And the application process does seem, fairly straightforward so far. Funding is going to be allocated for this one on a first come, first served basis. So instead of having a definitive end date on this program, it's basically until their money runs out. And for this one, there is a maximum incentive of $1 million per owner or operator. Payments are paid in 2 milestones. 50% is paid upon project procurement completion, so through proof of receipts of purchasing equipment, and then also 50% upon project completion. This program is going to be stackable with other programs. So we'll chat coming up here on the federal program that's coming out, but this would be stackable with the federal program to cover up to 100% of project costs. Now, eligibility under MTIP is that the projects do have to be retrofits. So even if you're using new technology at a new facility, that's not eligible under this program. It has to be changes to existing facilities. Existing facilities have to be located within Alberta and have to be regulated by Directive 60, fall under the requirements of Section 8 of Directive 60. You have to actually have the right to make changes at the facility, the changes that you're proposing. And so this program is really aimed at facilities that are not large emitters. So those facilities that are regulated under tier aren't eligible for this program because there's the other grant program available for those. So this is really aimed at the smaller to medium-sized facilities. And the facilities can be a part of an aggregate under tier. So that's something to note. And if you are choosing to accept this funding, you are forfeiting the right to generate and sell your carbon offsets as well. So it is one or the other with this project. You can't generate the revenue from selling carbon in addition to this program. And so the eligible project types under this program are listed here. They give you some examples of project types. Just because your project isn't on this list doesn't mean that it's not eligible. It just means that you do have to do an extra step to kind of request confirmation that it could be eligible. So there is a process for that as well. These are some of the project examples that they've given though. So again, looking at those pneumatic devices, switching them over to electrification or instrument air, moving from high bleed to low bleed instrumentation, or being able to capture any of the vent gas from your pneumatic devices. When it comes to your storage tanks, it could be adding a VRU, adding a clean combustor to remove your tank vapors. Compressors, we're looking at vent gas capture and utilization off of those seals there. And then there's also some other non-routine suggestions that they give, such as vent gas reduction from desanders and surface casing vent gas flow and gas migration projects. So in addition to these two projects, there are two other incentive programs that are expected to have more details released very soon. I actually heard one of them might be having some more details released like in the very near future here, but one of them is the Baseline Reduction Opportunity Assessment. So this is again a little bit of a smaller fund. It's $10 million. But the point of this fund is to support smaller and medium-sized operators to conduct those details assessments, to really see where there are opportunities within their assets to reduce methane. Sometimes that might involve emission calculations, an engineering study, or field measurements. So this is really giving them the opportunity to actually see where they stand with regards to compliance, and then some support and some options on methane reduction. And then one that I know a lot of people are waiting on right now is this Federal Emission Reduction Fund. This is a large fund of $750 million, and we are expecting an announcement late fall to early winter for how this program will work. And it's also supposed to be focused on methane emission reduction for the oil and gas industry. So I think a lot of people are waiting to hear how that incentive program will be run. Just to kind of summarize the presentation, I just want to say there's lots of ways that Macintosh Perry can help you guys achieve compliance with your facilities and access some of this incentive funding that's available right now. So we can support you guys in understanding the new regulations and how they impact your assets, as well as what's still coming up. We try to stay on top of all of the regulatory bodies and any hint of or suggestions of new regulations that are coming up. We can also support you in assessing your facilities for compliance. So whether that's reviewing your existing data or reviewing your existing plans that you may have already prepared for your facilities. We can do emission calculations and help with prioritizing the execution of your plans. So where can you get the biggest bang for your buck? What does your budget look like? And where can we help you achieve the most methane or overall emission reductions for your facilities? We definitely be able to suggest retrofits for you guys, including some of that new and emerging technology that's a really growing industry within Alberta right now. So there's lots of new things out there, and we go to a lot of different conferences, and we're constantly meeting with vendors to make sure that we're on top of what technology is out there to help you guys. We can also help with the incentive programs. So whether it's informing you when new ones come available, going over the nuances of them and sharing our experiences with how we've applied for them and who's qualified and who hasn't. And then also we can actually support you guys in doing those applications. For all of those programs that are available currently, it is allowed for someone to apply on your behalf. So we'd be happy to take that paperwork off your hands as well and really help you get those applications out the door for some of these incentive programs. And that's really what I had for you guys for the presentation. Thank you very much for listening in. And if you guys have any questions, we do have some contact information here, but I'm sure you also know how to get in touch with us here at Macintosh Perry. Thanks.